Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web Services Site Navigation and Structure workshop. To go over the agenda, we are first going to review a bit of the information covered in the pre-workshop activity. Then we will talk about exactly what information architecture is and how it relates to site navigation. Then we're going to talk about a great strategy called affinity mapping, which is a strategy that's going to help us achieve user-centered design. We'll then demo how an affinity mapping exercise would be conducted. We'll end by reviewing some of the key points covered in this workshop. If you have any questions about the content covered in today's workshop, feel free to email us at webservices@georgetown.edu. Like I mentioned, I first wanted to review the information that hopefully you all had the chance to look at before the workshop. And so to start off with more of a zoomed out lens of all of this information, this can all really fall under the umbrella of content strategy. And content strategy is essentially the creation, development, and management of the content that's on your site. And in order to go about doing all of this, you'll first want to start off with defining your website goals. This is going to help you identify a clear purpose for your site, and it's going to later help as a reference when you're unsure of what kind of content you want to be developing. After you define your website goals, you'll then want to take a look at your users and try to understand what their needs are. The website should be built for your users. And in order to build a website for your users, you'll need to know what it is they are looking for, or in other words, what their needs are. And if you remember from the content you reviewed about understanding your users, we go over a few different methods to identify your users' needs, such as user interviews, user personas, and user scenarios. Once you've identified your users' needs, you'll have a better idea of how to go about creating the kind of content that you should be for your site. The next step you'll then want to take is going to be to update and review the content on your site. This can be done by creating an inventory of all the content on your site and then conducting a content audit. It can be hard to manage the content that's on your site when you aren't familiar with the kind of content that you have already. It's important to take the time to go through the content you have before creating any new content. When you're doing this, you might find that you have content that is outdated, content on your site that is repetitive, or you might even discover a gap in your content that needs to be filled. Once you've done all of this, the next step is then going to be to think about how the content on your site is structured and organized. And this all falls under the umbrella of information architecture. And so information architecture isn't just about how the content on your site is structured and organized. Information architecture is a pretty broad topic, and it also covers topics like how your content relates to each other and how it's labeled in your navigation. And to show how site navigation relates to information architecture, site navigation sits under information architecture, and it consists of the navigational elements that you see in your site, like the main navigation menu, which you can see in this image. And the purpose of your site navigation should be to help your users in finding the information they are looking for, and it should also be functional and encourage your users' movement through the discovery process. And the discovery process is basically the journey that you want your users to take while on your site to achieve a certain goal. Going back to information architecture now, you can use information architecture to reimagine your navigation or also to check your existing site structure. And it can be broken down into the following sections. First comes user research. And like we talked about earlier, this would be things like user interviews, personas, and scenarios. And all this should be done to try and identify what your users' needs are. Next would be updating and reviewing content through content inventories and content audits. Then comes information grouping, taxonomy development, and finally, wireframing. Now, information grouping and taxonomy development is part of a strategy called affinity mapping. What I mean by information grouping is essentially just creating categories and subcategories of similar content. And taxonomy development refers to the labels you are going to give those categories and subcategories. And these labels are ultimately what's going to be appearing as the page titles and menu titles for your navigation. Wireframing would then be finalizing the structure of your site, usually in a visual manner. Now, to go into more details of what affinity mapping is and how to go about using this strategy. Affinity mapping, again, is a strategy that is going to help you produce a sound user-centered navigational structure. Affinity mapping is typically done in a team setting, and it's done by using Post-it notes, and you'll need usually a large surface to work with, and this can be something like a blank wall. And affinity mapping can be done either when building a site from scratch to figure out how your menu is going to be like, or it can be done at any point in your site's lifespan to reevaluate the structure of your site or to check an existing structure. The first step is going to be to write down your user's needs on different Post-it notes. And this is why it's helpful to do some user research beforehand, so you can really understand what those needs are going to be. If you recall from the Understanding Your Users workshop, you have different groups or audiences that are visiting your site with potentially different needs. A great way to keep track of your different user groups and audiences and what their needs are is to use separate colored Post-it notes to represent the different user groups. This can look something like using a pink colored note for your primary audience and a yellow one for your secondary audience. So once you've written down all of your user needs on the Post-it notes, you'll then want to begin to sort them into affinity buckets, which are going to be groups of similar content. And you can do this on whatever surface you're working on, like your wall. You're going to want to make sure you're sorting your users' needs in affinity buckets in a way that fits how your users would understand them. If you find that you have one category that is particularly large, feel free to create subcategories as well and sort your users' needs accordingly. Once you have all of your users' needs sorted, the next step would be to write down all of the major pieces of content on your site. And then once you have all of these pieces of content written down, you're then going to want to match those pieces of content with your user needs. When matching the content with your user needs, you want to make sure you're noting any gaps that you might find. And by gaps, this can look something like a need that isn't being met by a piece of content. If this is the case, you're going to want to take a look at your need and make note to add content so that you have those pieces of content that is going to satisfy all your users' needs. You might also find that you have a piece of content that isn't met by your user needs. If this is the case, you'll want to take a look at that piece of content and evaluate whether or not it's useful and usable information for the users that are visiting your site. If it's not, consider removing this piece of content from your site. Once you've completed the matching and noted any gaps that you might have found, the next step is then going to be to arrange the affinity buckets to create a sitemap of your site, and then compare the sitemap you've created during your affinity mapping exercise with the navigation of your current site, if applicable. You might find that you may have missed adding some content to your sitemap during the affinity mapping exercise. If this is the case, you're going to want to think about whether you missed that piece of content because you simply missed it, or did you maybe miss that piece of content because it just wasn't as useful and usable to your users as you thought it might have been. Once you've created this sitemap and are satisfied with the hierarchy of your affinity buckets, you'll then want to add and finalize menu labels and page titles for your categories and subcategories. And the reason why we start off by sorting by your users' needs instead of by the content on your site is because your site menu should reflect how your users are interacting with your site and how they are going about navigating the contents of your site, not necessarily how you internally view your site or by how the content on your site is currently structured. Moving on now to some tips on affinity mapping and just some things to keep in mind while you are conducting this exercise. The first thing to note is to avoid information overload. And by this, we generally just mean less is more. This is a great tip to keep in mind when creating that sitemap using your affinity bucket. Typically, for your main navigation on your site, you want to avoid having more than 4 to 6 categories. The reason for this is because information overload can typically set in when there is more than 4 to 6 items, and your users might have a hard time choosing between a bunch of different options. Another way to apply this tip is to consolidate your information on your site as much as possible. When conducting this exercise, you might find that you have maybe 4 pages about the same topic. If this is the case, really take a look at all the content on those different pages and see if you can try to consolidate that information into 1 or 2 pages instead. Another tip is to know your audience, because again, you should be organizing the content on your site according to your user's perspective. And it might be hard to do this without actually understanding your audience. So that's why it's important to conduct that user research beforehand so you have a great understanding of what your users' needs are and what they are looking for when on your site. Another tip is to use words that are intuitive and descriptive and easily scannable for your users. So this just means that you want to avoid using words or phrases that are specific to the internal operations of your organization, and instead use words that your users are going to understand. Another tip when creating these labels and page titles for your categories and subcategories is to use phrases that translate into actions. This can look something like using phrases such as apply now or request help. This can also help guide your users through that discovery process that we talked about earlier. Sometimes using phrases that translate into actions like apply now and request help can be better than using audience-based navigation titles such as students, faculty, and parents, because oftentimes users might not know which group they fit into. A user could be a student and faculty, so they might be unsure of what kind of information is in each group and which page that they should be visiting first to find the information that they are looking for. Another thing to keep in mind when writing these labels and page titles is to use editorial consistency. And this just means if you are going to be using phrases that translate into actions, just be consistent and use action phrases for the rest of your labels on that section. And to kind of help you visualize what a more simplified version of affinity mapping might look like in the end, I have this diagram on the right side of this slide where you can see that it has the user's needs in one colored sticky note, and then the content matched with the user's needs on a different colored sticky note. You can also see that there is a beginning of a site map being formed and that there are categories and subcategories. You can also see that there is a dotted line connecting one affinity group to another. Using dotted lines can be a great way to visually indicate that there is a connection between one affinity group and another, and that you might want to add a link when finalizing the structure of your site. Now I want to do a short little demo of how an affinity mapping exercise might go. And again, affinity mapping should be an exercise that you conduct in a team environment so that you can have as many perspectives as possible. And normally this would be done using Post-it notes or sticky notes on a blank wall. But since everything is being done virtually, you can use tools such as virtual whiteboards or virtual sticky notes to kind of replicate this exercise online. And so over here, I have a list of needs for a site, as well as bits of content. And so to start off, if you remember, the first step is to write down your user needs. And a great way to write down user needs at first is to follow this user needs statement. And so the user needs statement looks like this. As a user group, I need or want to know the user's needs so that I can achieve this goal. This is a great way to list your user's needs because it helps you identify which user group it's coming from, exactly what their need is, and what kind of goal they are trying to achieve. So an example of this is, as a prospective student, I need to know the application process so that I can successfully apply to GU. Once you have your user's needs listed in this format, you can then begin to write down your user's needs in shorthand on sticky notes. The reason writing down the user needs statement in this way before writing them down on the Post-it note can be helpful because it helps you have a well-rounded idea of where the user need is coming from and what they want to achieve. If you see over here, I have 3 different colored sticky notes representing 3 different user groups for this exercise. The yellow sticky notes are representing prospective students. The orange represents the needs of the parents of those students, and the pink represents current students. Over here, we have pieces of content that are marked in blue sticky notes. Since the user needs and the content is already written down, the first step that we would do is to sort the user needs into affinity buckets. And remember, when doing this sorting, you want to keep in mind how your users are going to be looking at your site. So for example, a user might group this need, what's the campus life like, with the needs such as, I want to tour the campus. These 2 user needs can be grouped into the same affinity bucket because a prospective student who's wanting to know more about what campus life is like might also want to tour the campus. As you can see, different user groups might have the same need. This need is coming from a parent of a student, that they also want to tour the campus. So you can group similar needs if they're the same on top of each other this way. Once you have your user needs grouped, the next thing that you would do is look at your content and try and match these pieces of content with your user needs. For example, if we had all the user needs sorted already, taking a look at this particular affinity bucket, I would look to see if any pieces of content can satisfy this group of user needs. It looks like content such as the campus would satisfy this user need. Once we have matched all of the content with the different user needs, the next step would then be to create a sitemap. And this would look something like creating a hierarchical structure of the affinity bucket. So, for example, the user might think that the broad category is campus life, and under that would be user needs such as wanting to tour the campus. Once you've created your sitemap, you would then begin to add labels and page titles for these categories and subcategories. Now to review some of the key points talked about during this workshop. I wanted to highlight again the importance of defining your website goals, taking that time to understand your users' needs, and taking the time also to familiarize yourself with the content on your site before focusing on information architecture. I also want you to remember that information architecture isn't just about how the content on your site is organized. It's also about how the content relates to each other and how it's labeled in your navigation. Another point to make is that your site menu and your site in general really should reflect how your users are interacting with your website and not how your organization is structured internally. So just something to keep in mind again throughout this whole information architecture process and the affinity mapping exercise that you want to be organizing based on your user's perspective. To go over the steps of how an affinity mapping exercise is conducted, the first step would be to list your user's needs, then group those needs into affinity buckets, list the content on your site and match the content with your user's needs, then arrange your affinity buckets to create a sitemap, and finally add menu labels and page titles. Another thing to know is to not be afraid to ask for help and discuss all of this information with your team. Affinity mapping really benefits from a bunch of different perspectives, so don't be afraid to talk with your team and ask for help when going about this exercise. This concludes the Site Navigation and Structure workshop. Be sure to check out our content strategy documentation for a more in-depth view of some of the content covered today. Of course, if you have any questions about anything covered today, feel free to email us at webservices@georgetown.edu. Thank you.